repair. Expansion of transit options rather than new highway or beltway construction. So the policy of the federal agencies over the last many years has been redirected from the creation of new highways into other transportation opportunities, such as light rail. Eliminating all new highway construction as much as they possibly can. This is the policy now of our federal agencies. It's not to meet the needs that you, the American people, have in being able to get to work, to shop, and so forth, but to make it as miserable as possible for you to drive so that you will shop locally with your bicycle or within walking distance. What has happened is the recommendations taken from Sustainable America is being filtered through our federal agencies, and especially the U.S. Housing Urban Development, HUD, to give big grants to organizations that will advance this agenda, including the creation of the Growing Smart legislative guidebook that was published a couple of years ago that literally goes through and tells local communities how they should stepwise go and create smart growth for their local communities. Millions of your taxpayer dollars funding this through the American Planning Association. What happens is that private property of every sort is being affected. And in fact, all of the federal laws dealing with environmentalism basically destroy private property rights in a very systematic way. And also, smart growth does exactly the same thing. The private property rights are destroyed. Now, earlier in my discussion, I talked to you briefly about the importance of private property rights, but there is a dimension that has become now internationally known over the last years, coming from a $26 million study by a guy by the name of Hernando de Soto in the publication of The Mystery of Capital. He did about a 6-year study internationally, determining why capitalism worked in the first world nations, especially that of the United States, and is an utter failure in the third world nations in the former communist blocs. Why hasn't capitalism worked in these third world nations and former communist states? It's a fascinating book, one that I would recommend to anyone to read, because all of a sudden you can clearly see why the third world nations are third world nations. For instance, most of us don't realize that 70% of all small businesses in the United States are started with equity loans on personal homes. 70%. So the value of your home, the amount of equity that you have in it, depending upon how much of that loan you've paid off, can be then plowed into a new business opportunity, creating wealth for yourself and ultimately for your community and nation. 70%. A huge portion. Most of us think of the international corporations as being the primary source of our economic well-being. They are not. It is the small businesses of America, and they depend upon their equity in their homes to create their businesses. Now, in developing nations, it requires 10 to 20 years to register private property. So what happens in that 10 to 20 years is that they give up. They have to go through as many as 120 to 230 socialist bureaucratic steps to accomplish a title transfer from one person to another. Hence, they don't do it. It's recognized locally. The local people recognize that that property belongs to Mr. Jones or whoever it happens to be, and they can sell it for a few $1,000s to someone else. But there is no actual legal protection of that property. And because there is no legal protection of that property, there is what Hernando de Soto says is dead capital. if you do not have legally established property rights, then the bank cannot loan you against the equity that is there but cannot be secured. And therefore, what happens is that, as he calls it, is dead capital, is there but cannot be used. And therefore, these people cannot borrow $5,000, $10,000 against the property value of their home to start a business. So the business is never created, or the businesses are never expanded. And hence, they stay in poverty and will ever stay in poverty. Last year, I attended the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, South Africa. And all these people were coming from all over the world to protest the fact that they were not allowed to be involved in the global market system. Why? Because they had no private property rights. They had no ability to create their own businesses. It was the international community, corporations that would come in and start a business employing these people for pennies on the dollar, but these people had no opportunity to buy into that to secure their own future. It's another way of serfdom. He goes on to say that DeSoto estimates that there is $9.3 trillion in this world in dead capital, capital that cannot be accessed by these people to build their own wealth. That's more than all the capital involved in all the stock markets of the world. It's also 93 times more than all the foreign aid ever given and 46 times all the loans ever given by the World Bank. If this dead capital was available to these people, they would not need foreign aid. And it's entirely due to the fact that they have no guaranteed, formalized private property rights. It's astonishing. In fact, DeSoto goes on to say, basically, the wealth of a nation is directly correlated to how much they have formal private property rights in existence. And this comes out, and I realize in saying this, that there are other things that are going into the national wealth, the average salaries and so forth, than just private property rights. But private property rights makes up the overwhelming source of national and individual wealth. The Americans, United States citizens, earn an average of $36,000 a year. Now compare that to the socialist Europeans that have an increasingly growing socialist bureaucracy controlling the ability for them to create wealth. And it drops to $21,000 a year. And if you go to the old former communist states like Russia, it's less than $1,000 a year. It is striking how important private property rights are, not only to your freedom and your liberty, but to your ability to live and have a pursuit of happiness as is guaranteed in the Declaration of Independence. Because you cannot attain it without private property rights. And smart growth literally takes those away. Let's just take a look at the preservation of open space that we constantly hear about, that we're supposed to be losing so much of. Are you aware that the amount of developed land in the United States is what you see on this map? The red areas are what is called developed land by the U.S. Census Bureau. Does that look like we're losing all of our rural landscape or open space? Let's take a different way of looking at it. Only 5% of the American landscape is classed as urban or developed. Only 5%. Is that a threat? 95% is rural.